We all have rituals. Things we do to keep a sense of normalcy, to keep our feet on the ground. When I was a kid, my ritual was riding my bike down Coulter Street with my best friend Jonas. Every Saturday, we'd go to the top of the hill and ride down like the devil himself was after us. Coulter Street was steep and dangerous, but damn, if it didn't feel good to ride down. We used to race each other at first, but eventually we just rode for the sake of riding. My life was kind of chaotic back then. My parents weren't always on great terms with each other, so riding down that hill was always an escape for me. Then one summer, when I turned 11 years old, everything changed. Jonas and I had made it to the top of Coulter Street, like we always did. I'll never forget how hot it was that day. The humidity made it worse. Every step felt like you were walking through a sauna. We were getting ready to ride down when he showed up. There were two things that preceded his arrival. The sound of Mr. Abernathy's old dog barking wildly from somewhere in the distance, and the sound of wings flapping as a murder of crows made their ascent to the sky. "Can I bike with you guys?" he asked. Jonas and I turned in surprise at the sound of his voice. The kid standing before us looked about our age. His hair was brown and longish. His skin was pale and he had bags under his eyes. His clothes were tattered and looked like hand-me-downs. His bicycle looked ancient compared to the sleeker models Jonas and I had. He looked poor, but there was something else too. When I think back on it, he looked mythic in some ways, like he'd leapt out of the pages of some lost great American novel. He looked completely out of place. "Sure," I said. "We're just going to ride down the hill." You might be thinking how strange it is that I didn't ask the boy his name. But when you're 11, those kind of things don't always jump to mind right away. Sometimes you meet a strange boy and you don't ask him his name. And he was a strange boy. Not just how unkempt looking he was, but the town of Raleigh wasn't very big, and I was familiar with just about every boy my age. Didn't know them all by name, but I knew of them at least. We all went to the same school after all. In small towns like Raleigh, everybody seems to know everybody. But I had never seen this kid before in my life. In any case, we rode down the hill. Me, Jonas, and the strange new boy. And when we reached the bottom, the boy just nodded and then rode away. "Maybe he's from Jefferson," Jonas said when the boy was gone. Jefferson was another town that was far away. It seemed rather unlikely that he rode all the way from Jefferson on his own. So Jonas and I came to the conclusion that he must have moved from Jefferson to Raleigh this summer with his folks. That's how we got to calling him the Jefferson Kid. Throughout the following week, Jonas and I wondered if the Jefferson Kid would show up again on Saturday to ride down with us. We joked about his sudden appearance the other day. But deep down, there was something unspoken between us. The truth of it was, the Jefferson Kid had unsettled us. Not only intruding on our Saturday ritual, but there was something off about him. His old and tattered clothes, pale white skin, and those sunken, tired-looking eyes. Sure enough, the very next Saturday, he appeared again. This time, he didn't even ask our permission to bike with us. He simply rode up on that old-looking bike of his and nodded. You might be thinking that this is when I finally asked him his name, but you'd be wrong. Instead, I turned to Jonas, who just shrugged, and the shrug said everything to me. We wouldn't question the Jefferson Kid. We'd simply allow him to be here with us. And so the three of us rode down the hill, and when we reached the bottom, the Jefferson Kid merely nodded again and rode off. And that's how our Saturdays went that summer. We'd reach the top of the hill and, without fail, the Jefferson Kid would appear, and we'd ride down with him. He never asked us our names, and we never asked his. During the week, Jonas and I never discussed how the Jefferson Kid knew when to appear on Saturday, especially when we didn't always go at the same time. We didn't discuss his tattered clothes or sunken eyes. We accepted his company, while also completely ignoring him. Because there was something in the back of our heads that was screaming that something was completely wrong about this boy. And neither Jonas or I wanted to acknowledge it. And we never, ever spoke to the Jefferson Kid. As we reached the bottom of the hill, he would simply nod and ride away. That was until one Saturday late in August. We reached the bottom of the hill, but instead of nodding and riding away, the Jefferson Kid turned to Jonas and I and spoke. "You guys want to see my house?" It was surreal hearing him talk. He'd only ever said one thing to us before, when he asked if he could bike with us. We had accepted him as a part of our ritual, and throughout the weeks he eventually blended in. Him speaking cut through all of that, and reminded Jonas and I of his strange intrusion in our lives. Your house?" was all I could say. "Yeah," the Jefferson Kid said. "You want to come and see it? Since we're friends and all." All this time, I had never considered the Jefferson Kid my friend. Yet, hearing him call me that, it made me feel ashamed of myself, of how coldly I'd treated him during our bike rides. I turned to Jonas, and I could tell he was having the same reaction. When Jonas caught my eyes, he simply shrugged, though it was a meek and unsure shrug. "Okay," I said. "Let's go to your house. I have to eat supper soon, but I can come by for a little." "Okay," the Jefferson Kid said, smiling. "Follow me." As we followed the Jefferson Kid on our bikes, I was hoping he would lead us towards one of the familiar cul-de-sacs or neighbourhoods around Rayleigh. But as we rode, I started to see that would not be the case, because we were heading towards the edge of Rayleigh, towards the woods that surrounded the town. We turned onto one of the beat-up dirt roads that went through the woods. Eventually, we turned onto an even more beat-up path that took us deeper in. The trees seemed to leer down at us. It was getting dark and I was starting to feel uneasy. The path was getting more overgrown the further we went and less welcoming for riding. I had never gone this far into the woods before. Eventually, and surprisingly, we came upon a 2-story house. It was the worst looking home I had ever seen. If you looked up the word decrepit in the dictionary, there would surely be a picture of this house. The roof seemed to be sinking in. Many of the windows were boarded up or shattered. The wood was dark and mossy, and the angles of the house were just wrong. I wouldn't have been able to describe it this way at the time, but now, as an adult, I can tell you the house looked like something out of a 1920s German expressionist film. And there were no lights on. Yet the Jefferson kid rode up to the house, casual as can be. Jonas and I merely stared at the house in shock. "You live here?" Jonas said. "Sure do," the Jefferson kid said. He kicked out his bike stand and walked up to the porch. The wood creaked horribly beneath his feet, and when he opened the door, I thought for sure it had come off its hinges. Through the doorway, I could see nothing but darkness. Are your parents home?" I asked. The Jefferson kid did not answer. Instead, he stepped into the dark entryway. The shadows of the house enveloped him in an instant. "Are you guys coming?" The Jefferson kid's voice came from somewhere in the house, but he was not visible at all. Staring into the darkness of the doorway was almost hypnotizing. I could feel something pulling at me, inviting me into the house. I quickly turned away and blinked my eyes. Sorry, but I have to go now. Jonas does too," I said. And when I pulled at Jonas, I could see he felt the same thing I had just felt. The pull. "Oh, already?" the Jefferson kid said from inside that hellish home. "Are you sure you don't want to come inside?" This time, I didn't answer. I turned my bike around and hit Jonas on the arm, and in seconds we were riding away. I didn't even know the way back. I simply rode, and this time, I really did feel as if the devil was behind me. We rode for what felt like an eternity. But eventually, Jonas and I made it back onto the dirt road and eventually back into town. Somehow. Jonas and I agreed on several things that night. That we would never go back to that house. And that we would never ride down Coulter Street again, for fear of running into the Jefferson kid. And if we ever did see the Jefferson kid again, we would not speak to him, and we would tell each other. A couple of weeks had passed and the new school year was about to begin. The leaves had begun to turn from bright green to shades of brown, yellow and red. I loved fall. It was the perfect time of the year. Saying goodbye to those gross humid days and hello to crisp, clear autumn weather. Those Saturdays spent with Jonas and the Jefferson kids started to feel like a surreal dream, even though not much time had actually passed. Jonas and I had not spoken about the house in the woods since that night. My mum dropped me off on the first day of school. She had another terrible argument with Dad that morning. I was beginning to really miss those bike rides down Coulter Street. They were so good for clearing my head and making me forget my worries. But I couldn't risk going back there and running into him. Seeing the school building would normally be demoralising, as I hated the end of summer. But on this day, it felt good. Wholesome even. And it was my first day of middle school. A whole new adventure awaited me. I was ready to put the events of summer behind me. As I walked towards the building, I saw Jonas' familiar face. We slapped hands and made our way inside. Jonas seemed to be in good spirits. He made several jokes about the start of the year and which one of us would get a girlfriend first. Still, there was an unspoken question hanging between us. Would the Jefferson kid show up at school? We'd both theorised that the Jefferson kid had moved from Jefferson to Rayleigh with his parents during the summer. Although he never gave us his age. If I had to guess, I would have said he's 11 like Jonas and I. Which means if he was going to school, he should have been there that day. Jonas and I walked into our first class. I was almost terrified that we'd see the Jefferson kid sitting in the back of that room, wearing those old tattered clothes, staring at us with those tired, sunken eyes. Want to come over to my house again? I shuddered at the thought. But as I walked in, he was nowhere to be seen. And he didn't show up at all throughout the rest of the day. At the end of the day, I'd almost completely forgotten about him. Almost. Because while there was a part of me that was terrified of running into him, there was another part of me that wanted him to show up. Because if he did show up at school, it would mean that maybe he was just a normal kid after all, dirt poor and living in a decrepit home in the woods. But normal all the same. After all, monsters don't go to school and get homework, right? I felt an alarming sense of dread as the last bell of the school day rang. The Jefferson kid did not show up. Which means the Jefferson kid might not have been a normal kid after all. He might not have been a kid in the first place. I kept thinking of that pulling sensation coming from the house, like something was beckoning me to walk into the house. The following weeks went fairly normally. I woke up, ate breakfast, Mum and Dad fought, Mum dropped me off at school, I came home, did homework, woke up, rinse and repeat. I still hung out with Jonas on the weekends, though we didn't go biking as much. Part of it was that the weather was getting colder, but also our bikes were a reminder of our time with the Jefferson kid. It wasn't until just a week before Halloween that things took a turn for the worse. I'll never forget that night. It was 9 p.m. and I was sitting in the living room watching TV with my dad, who was nursing his fourth beer of the night. The phone rang and my mum answered. After what sounded like a worried conversation, my mum stepped into the living room, holding the phone to her shoulder. "Sweetie," my mum said to me, "have you seen Jonas today?" I saw him at school. I said. "Did he say he was going anywhere today? After school?" My mum asked. "No, why?" My mum didn't answer. She got back on the phone and then a couple of minutes later hung up and came back into the living room. "That was Jonas' mum," my mother said. "She said Jonas never came home today. They're going to be calling the police soon."
"Waste of resources,"
my father said.
"These kids go running off. He'll show up again, trust me."
This resulted in another argument between my parents. I didn't even hear them. I had gotten good at zoning them out. I sat there and stared blankly at the television. Jonas never came home. What could have happened to him? But deep in the back of my head, I already knew the answer. I walked up to my bedroom and looked out the window. Our house was on a hill, not unlike Coulter Street. In the distance, if you looked hard enough, you could see just the beginning of the woods that surrounded Raleigh. And somewhere deep in those woods was a 2-story house that was home to a boy my friend Jonas and I called the Jefferson Kid. I didn't want to believe that Jonas was there. But deep in the back of my head, there was a part of me that knew he was. And that part of me was screaming.